Hey, everybody. Thanks for jumping on today. Welcome back. We are here to talk about Costa Brown wines and specifically one of my nearest and dearest, most exciting things that we've done over the last few years. We are going to be talking about the release of our 2021 vintage Burgundy wines. Yes, they are from Burgundy. Pretty exciting. So we're going to talk all about that. We're going to do a tasting through four of the wines or all four of the wines that are in the release this year. Quick reminder and introduction. My name is Regina Sanz, our General Manager of Business Development here at Costa Brown. And I have with me Julian Halsepian, our incredible winemaker. We're going to talk about some fun stuff today. So keep those questions coming in the chat and we will be talking about Burgundy. Hey, Jules, how's it going, my friend?
Good. We just wrapped up a little bit of fruit processing today, so we have a little bit of a cooler vintage on our hands, a little bit of a later vintage, but all is good. Just got to extend and enjoy our summer a bit more. But yeah, process a little Pinot. We got a little Chardonnay coming in tomorrow, a little bit more Pinot, and I think in the next 2 or 3 weeks we're going to be really cranking here and getting through the majority of our fruit before the end of October. Certainly hope so.
And I've been getting a lot of questions specifically this year, and I think this is maybe a good place to start the conversation. I mean, we have different vintages, different weather patterns every single year in just our vineyards in California and Oregon. Let's maybe talk a little bit about that, not only from this year, but also years past with Burgundy. You're now making wine in 3 completely different regions, well, more like 8 completely different regions, or plus, kind of depending on how you slice it. Let's talk a little bit about those differences, your sort of experience over the years between making wine in Burgundy, making wine in California, making wine in Oregon, making wine in different parts of California, those vintage variations and sort of what that looks like and how you kind of think about that.
Yeah. Well, Pinot is the ultimate expression of terroir. And part of terroir is the climate. And of course, every year we have a little bit of a different set of circumstances. I would say, based on my experience, and California is definitely where I have the most experience, our vintage variation, to be perfectly honest, is relatively small. We have typically very good weather. On the scale of the climates that are good for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, we are on the warmer end of that, right? So our climates are kind of on the, if you had to look at the whole range, we're on the warmer side of that equation. Oregon and Burgundy are kind of on the cooler side of that spectrum. So when they're, find themselves in precarious situations, it might be on a cool vintage where that's when their vineyards and their grapes might not ever get ripe. Whereas in California, we find ourselves typically sometimes in trouble when we're in a really hot vintage because that pushes us over that limit. But, being from a warmer climate, our fruit, flavors typically always arrive, and that is our lead component. That's what our wines are known for. So for whatever reason, our vintage variation is typically rather small. And our wines are very consistent from year on and year out, and they tell a slightly different story. But we definitely can very much rely on a very consistent flavor coming out of the California wines. Whereas in Oregon and in Burgundy, the story is a little bit different. Because they're on the cooler climate spectrum, they tend to have more, they tend to be a little bit more, sensitive to the vintage and the weather, and the wines can be quite different. So, for example, in Oregon, the seasons there typically are confronted with 1 or 2 serious rain events. In California, when we see a little bit of rain, everyone starts to get really worried. But in Oregon, it's like, well, how many inches? 2 inches? Okay, well, what's happening after that? You got 3 or 4 days of sun? Perfect. Let's let it hang. But if it's like, well, we have, maybe 2 to 3 inches of rain plus another storm after that, then it's time to go. And that might force people to pick their fruit maybe a little bit earlier than they wanted to. and the result of that is a different wine.
Hmm.
And the same is true in Burgundy. And so in 2021, of course, there was a really really bad frost, which is rather unusual. I mean, it happens from time to time, and it's been happening a bit more frequently lately. But 2021, there was a really really bad frost, coupled with maybe a little bit of climate change, where the seasons are a little bit warmer
Hmm.
earlier. So we had bud break, a touch earlier than we would otherwise. At the end of March, early April, followed by what would be considered a seasonably normal event. I mean, it was cold and it was somewhat unusual, but coupled with the fact that the vines had just awoken and they just started to push out their tender, super super tender, tiny little buds,
Hmm.
very delicate green tissue, and then followed by three consecutive nights of really really cold sub-freezing temperatures. They basically, all those little buds froze and
Yeah.
died. So that set off the vintage to a difficult, challenging start in 2021.
And I would love to kind of interject here, right? A few different thoughts. When I put in my sommelier brain, the differences I always really see, and this has been, by the way, as long as we've been making wine, right? We as a society, community of human beings making wine, when you're living in these climates that are much colder and much warmer from one another, you see your point about consistency for wines in California. At least for us, all of the vines that we're working with have a very mitigating sort of temperature influence by their proximity to the ocean. And when you go to more inland climates, you add, latitude, and you add elevation, and you add these kind of changes in overall temperatures, you are going to have different. That is the terroir. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just the truth. It's just how we sort of chase these different flavors for different reasons. And so, yes, are generally speaking wines from California, vintage to vintage, more similar than wines from Burgundy, vintage to vintage? Yes. And the other thing I wanted to kind of comment on the frost is, just because it was, I think the biggest sad piece about frost is it doesn't necessarily affect the quality, it affects the quantity, right? Like those buds don't even have a chance to make it out the gate, and so we just have less grapes. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean the wine is not as good, it just means we just have less grapes to make wine, so less of it.
Right. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that kind of specifically, and maybe we can start the conversation around the Volnay and jump into our first wine and kind of talk through that, the difference of the Volnay of this vintage, the 21 vintage versus the Volnay of the 20 vintage, and
Mm-hmm.
just kind of those differences between the
Yeah.
two.
Yeah. I mean, just to kind of follow up with the rest of the vintage, like you said, it wasn't a matter of quality. It's a matter of quantity. So we saw significant losses due to the frost. 80% of the whites, were lost.
Hmm.
And especially the whites, because the whites wake up a little bit earlier than the Pinots. And so that was the most impacted variety. And then, of course, the reds saw huge losses as well, followed by a long kind of wet spring. But, a lot less. So what happens is the grapevine has to produce another shoot that has, clusters on it. But typically they're never, sometimes they're blanks. They
Hmm.
don't have any clusters on them. And sometimes there's just one, but rarely are there two clusters, which is, the typical number that a shoot will produce. So yeah, a lot
Hmm.
less quantity, and hence, a very, very competitive market to acquire grapes and must and wine. And we were super ecstatic with the fact that we were able to continue to produce wine on a difficult vintage. So yeah, the 2021 Volnay, when you talk about seasons, I mean, I guess we're getting into the variation aspect of this, because the 2020 vintage was very different from the 2021. I mean, what's beautiful about Burgundy is that Volnay, Pommard, all the different wines we produce, along with every other wine from the region, there's a typicity to each of them, which is the fun part of things, right? I mean, regardless of the vintage, there's a thread of consistency that you can find in each wine, and they just sometimes are, they kind of have different shades to go along with that. So the 2020s, a warm vintage for Burgundy, a dry vintage for Burgundy, dark wines, concentrated fruit, really expressive wines. 2021, much more elegant, much more floral, but very similar and true to the place. So Volnay, it tends to be a little bit more elegant, a little bit softer, and floral. So this wine is all of that. So I guess to put a point on it, while the growing season was not classic in the sense of that's not how things usually go, and we certainly don't want that to become a normal season. The wines that were produced in 2021 are, I would say, more classical in the sense that they're a little bit more restrained, they're more elegant, they're more floral, and they're really, really beautiful. So, they don't necessarily 1+1 = 2 in terms of the growing season, the wines, but classical wines. So the Volnay, beautiful, elegant, rose petal, very charming, kind of enchanting wine, complex, beautiful wine. Much lighter in color, compared to the 2020. Across the board, all the wines just don't have that deep, rich color. They're just a little bit more kind of what you'd expect. And it's a really, really beautiful wine.
I was going to interject too that there's a gentleman on this following us right now. Hi, Drew. We do a series called Pinot Talks relatively often. We have an Instagram account for that if you're interested in kind of following that journey. And the notion of Pinot Talks is that we take wines from the Costa Brown portfolio, some more wines from some other Pinot Noirs from the Darkroom portfolio, some other Pinot Noirs from friends and neighbors locally here in California, and then also wines from Burgundy, and we taste a collection of them blind with a group of exciting people in the room. And what we have noticed, or what I noticed on the 2020 vintage of honestly all of the Burgundies, whether they were from us, from Costa Brown, or from other Burgundy producers, they were really tough to sort of guess that they were from Burgundy in a traditional sense, because they did have this, or they do have this really dark, really inky, very opulent color to them. Versus the 21 vintage, we're seeing maybe what one might more classically assume is a Burgundy wine, right? Lighter colors, more herbal characteristics, less fruit characteristics. And the truth is, the grapes just didn't get us ripe, right? In 20, they got a lot more ripe, and so they had a lot more, maybe what one would assume is California style wine, and so they were richer and more ripe. And I think that's what's really neat about Pinot Noir period and the world of wine in general. Vintage to vintage, from the same producer, from the same place, from the same vineyard, from the same grapes. It's pretty cool to see something so different when Mother Nature really does put that stamp of terroir onto it. And sort of the reason to, I don't know, be obsessed with wine as we obviously are.
Yeah, I agree.
And I agree with you. This Volnay is so delicate, so rose petal, so pretty. I'm thrilled for those of you that have an allocation of it in your offering. So definitely log in and check it out. Before we jump into the next wine, Pommard, a quick comment on how these wines are released, and maybe this is a good way for us to kind of talk about the history of the why we chose to make wine in Burgundy. But we're doing something a little bit out of the norm. There's a lot of Burgundy producers that have come to the United States and started making wine under their label here in the States. Domaine Drouhin is a really great example of that. But there are very few, if none, other than ourselves, that have gone the other direction, that have gone to Burgundy and said, we'd really love to make wine under an American brand. There are lots of, friends in the industry that have gone to Burgundy to make wine, but typically under a different label, not under the same label that, is our history and our founding and the same winemaker and, right? So, I'd love to kind of kick us off, because I've gotten this question a lot. What is the history of why we chose to do this? And we can kind of get into the Pommard from there. I think 2020 was a really interesting and great vintage for us to have this epiphany that, we were having not the best year. I don't think the world was having the best year in 2020. There's a lot going on, mostly relating to, personally, vintage, a lot of things in the States were rough in that year. And it was one of those moments where myself and Julian and some other folks on the team were kind of the the silver lining of that year is that it forced all of us to reimagine the way that we talk about wine, the way that we sell wine. And in some beautiful ways, it allowed us to kind of think outside the box. I don't think we ever would have really believed we could do this if it weren't for us having such a challenging, just mental, emotional year. It was like, I think you made the joke, Julian, like, oh, F it. We should just go make wine in Burgundy as a joke almost. And then it was like, wait, well, why shouldn't we try? And here we
Mm-hmm.
are 3 years later. It's pretty cool. And we're still making the wine. So that's sort of my recollection of it. But I'd love you to kind of talk a little bit about that. And yes, these wines are really from Burgundy. They're not, a French looking label from California. They're really from
Yeah.
Burgundy. So maybe talk a little bit about that as we move into the Pomard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm going on I think it's my 12th vintage at Costa Brown now. And I remember the early days, we were Sonoma Coast, Russian River, that was our home, our backyard, and our identity. We also made a fair amount of wine in San Lucia Highlands. That was like our extension, territory. But we were really, really focused on this place.
Mm-hmm.
And, around 2016, we kind of we looked around and we said, why not go get great Pinot in other regions? Why are we confined to just these, uh, you know, these imaginary boundaries
Mm-hmm.
that people set up? Why not, if there's grapefruit in Santa Rita, like Mount Carmel and Rita's Crown, why not go get it? If
Mm-hmm.
there's not grapefruit in Anderson Valley, Cerise Vineyard, why not make Pinot Noir, right? We're obsessed with Pinot. We love the expression of Pinot. And so that was what started that broke us from like our I don't know, from our local, our vision, I guess, right? In
Mm-hmm.
terms of just focusing on this area. And then, we explored different areas. We were loving the experience and the journey of going to these different areas and learning about the different terroirs and the growers, the communities, the people, and expressing that and promoting the different regions. And basically in 2020, it was one of those times where, yeah, I mean, it was a chance to think outside the box and hit the reset button a little bit and go, what can we do? And it was a little bit of a joke at first, and it was like, yeah, right. And then Tim was like, yeah, let's do it. And I was like, come on, like, how? What are you talking about? And it was like, there's no way. And then there was like, well, let's look into it. It's like, look into it. Tell me what you find out. And it came back with some legs. And
Yeah.
we have friends in France. I've been visiting Burgundy, for the better part of 10 years now, and getting to know people. And we kind of asked them, hey, what do you think about this idea? And they were like, yeah, that sounds cool,
Yeah.
and so there was some positive feedback right away, and all of a sudden it was like, wait a second, the door is open.
Yeah.
Let's get this, so yeah, it all kind of fell into place rather quickly.
And
you know at,
I don't think it hurts that your dad's from Bone either. I think it
no,
also like opened the door a bit for,
yeah,
your cultural heritage and adoration of the place too, right?
there's definitely a interesting full circle going on with
Yeah.
the project in Burgundy, because my grandmother was born outside of Neuilly Saint Georges, in a very small village, a little bit outside the wine region, but not more than 25 minutes from the town. And my dad's uncles worked in cellars in Neuilly Saint Georges, and things like that. So there's a very interesting familia connection to the area. I am half French, so that part of it is kind of, it started back there. So yeah, to be now a part of the production in France and Burgundy is just, it's up, it's a dream. It still feels like a dream. It's really, really cool. I am a fan of all wines. I'm a fan of Burgundy. I'm a fan of California. And to be able to produce both is truly remarkable. So, yeah, so, 2020 rolls around, and all of a sudden we kind of like within a pretty short amount of time, we figured out a way to make this work. And it was like a needle in a haystack in terms of like understanding the nuts and bolts as to how to do it. And it was a big risk at the same time, right? I mean, nobody's done this before. People do this on larger scales with cheaper wine, let's just say. But we're doing this at a very, very high quality, very small scale. So like there just wasn't the infrastructure, there wasn't like no, there was no blueprint for this.
Hmm.
There was nobody I could call and say, hey, by the way, how do you send over 250 gallons of wine when you want to, and there's
Yeah.
nobody. Like someone's like, I know how to send over like 40,000 gallons of wine. You're like,
Yeah.
okay, well, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So yeah, everything was different, everything was new, and but we worked it out, and it took a lot of people. It wasn't just me. I feel like I'm a very small player in this project because so many people had to figure out
Oh my
things on how to
gosh.
make it work, and so that was really cool too. But yeah, we have excellent partners in Burgundy who are assisting in this operation. There are eyes and ears on the ground. We speak to them, regularly. We're sourcing fruit, we're sourcing barrels, we're sourcing must, the whole bit. It's like we're doing business in Burgundy exactly how they do business in
Hmm.
Burgundy. There's nothing different from that.
Yeah.
The difference is that we're bottling it in the United States. We're bringing it to California, bringing it to Costa Brown, and that is really neat. We need to figure out a way to get a little hospitality program going for like the short time that it's here in California before it's bottled, and you can taste California, Oregon, and Burgundy all at the same time out of a tank or barrel. That would be cool. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and the thing is just growing. It's gaining momentum. It's getting more and more the way we want it to. I mean, they've been making wine in Burgundy for 2,000 years,
Yeah.
and it's a long history, and we're into our fourth vintage. The 2023 vintage is on its way right now. It's wrapping up as we speak. Um, but it's a long game, like we're growing this, and it's becoming more and more of how we want it to be, just like how it is in California. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Anyway,
I
uh,
think there's a couple quick fun stories to this too. People ask me a lot, oh, but does Julian? Yeah, Julian actually goes to France a lot. Not very fair. He gets to go way more than I do, but he's there a lot, and he's very much involved in the actual winemaking process, which was I think really important. This isn't buying custom crush, somebody else made it, and we're just slapping a label on it. This is very much making decisions around, to Julian's point, the same way that he makes decisions around the wines in California at our winery here. Those same decisions are being made in Burgundy, with the way that Burgundian wines are made, right? And one of my favorite stories is specifically on the 2020 when we were trying to figure out how in the heck are we going to get this wine once it's been made, once it's, we've got the juice, it's aged, it's in barrel, we figured out the program, blending process is starting, all these things, right? How are we going to get it here? How are we going to get it from Burgundy, from Beaune to California? And there are these things that are designed. They are, I kid you not, they are called spacecraft boxes. And it's basically these very neat anaerobic environment that essentially preserves the wine almost like I like to say in stasis as it comes on these refrigerated container ships across the ocean to us here in California and then decanted here at the winery to then be bottled in California. So it is, if you watch the video, there's a video on our website, definitely check it out under the Burgundy series. There's a really cool shot in the video, which I was really, it was fun to kind of be part of that process and go to Burgundy and talk to the team there and come back here to California. There's a really cool shot where it pans from the cellar in Burgundy to the cellar here in California. And you literally can kind of see that journey in that shot where, you sort of see old world, new world, Julian in both places. It's very cool. So I encourage, check it out, learn more about the story because it's been a really, labor of love, I think, for all of us.
mhm.
There's a couple of questions in the chat. Gosh, I would say let's start talking about the Pommard. And one of the big questions that I saw in the chat is a great question about aging and preference. And I'm going to kick it off by saying Julian and I have different palates. I tend to like wines that are, I could age them forever and drink really old wines. I mean, I like younger wines as well. But I would say, you know, if you ask me if the wine is really well made, and these wines definitely fall in that camp, the key components to whether or not a wine ages is the acid and the tannic structure. And obviously the fruit's an important part of that. But when we're talking about aging, we really are talking about that. What is the tannic structure and what is the acid? Burgundy in and itself is a place that gives us plenty of acid and plenty of tannin, some sites more than others. And I'll kind of let Julian talk about that as we talk about Pommard. So when you've got a wine with great acid and great tannin, you can age that puppy for as honestly as long as you like. You know, there's windows of recommendation. The question was, should I age the 2020 longer? Or the person in the chat thought that the 2020 Chambertin from KB that he had last year, he said, I think great. If you think you can use more time, then age it. That's a personal preference. You know, some folks like to drink their wines younger, which are going to show more fruit characteristic. And some folks like to drink their wines older that are going to be more of the, you know, leather and spice and more herbal characteristics, less of a fruit expression. Both really delicious, but it's kind of personal preference, honestly. And I'll hand it to you, Julian. What are your thoughts on that, you know, and maybe talk about the Pommard with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it comes down to personal preference. I mean, I've heard from some people who are very, you know, well experienced. They are in the game for a long time, and they just say, "I like drinking young wine."
Totally.
You know,
Totally.
it's not like the more you're, you know, like, you know, the deeper you are in the game, the older the wines, you know, you have to drink. It's just about drinking what you want to drink and being comfortable with that. And so, you know, the younger the wine, the fresher they are. The older, the more, you know, tertiary, secondary, tertiary aromas and flavors you get, and they can become more complex and interesting, but a little bit less approachable. The 2021 wines, they are right now. I think they're very, very bright. They're very, very fresh. They're very, very bright, and their main components are red fruit, a little bit of like, you know, orange blossom, cherry blossom, a little bit of herbal character. So like it's a youthful expression of a bright red kind of Pinot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you know, I'd say for me personally, when we're making a lot of different wines, you know, we make a lot of different wines. I think for those of you who are in this selection, but I always think that the wine tastes best about a year after they've been bottled. And so for any given release, we're talking at least, you know, on average, let's say 6 months after the wine has been released. So for example, I think that the 2020s right now are tasting absolutely beautifully. We bottled those last March, so they've been in bottle for about 18 months. The 2021s we bottled in April. And I think I would start drinking the 21s at the end of this winter. Let's just say like around February,
Yeah.
March.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean that's where I'm at. And then I think that I think they're both going to age a long time. The 2021 is you know, a little bit more like I'd say higher acids, a little bit stronger acids. So and probably the same amount of tannin as the 2020s. So I think they're both going to age for quite a long time.
And And I think that, you know, to speak to the Pommards in particular, you know, traditionally speaking, Pommard, and I think it definitely comes through both in the 2020 and in the 21, there's always a bit of a rusticity. There's a beautiful sort of mid-palate, I call it iron characteristic. And I mean that with complete adoration because it is such a beautiful sort of minerality, almost flavor that really is coming from the soils of the sites in Pommard. So when you think about Volnay, which is this more delicate rose petal perfumed wine, Pommard, both in the 2020 and in the 21 vintages, have a much more kind of rustic feel across the mid palate. I'd say the difference between the two vintages is that one, again, as Julian was saying, has a much more inky sort of fruit characteristic to it from that warmer vintage in 2020, whereas this is more of those kind of that iron minerality is still there, but it's a little bit lighter on sort of the fruit spectrum, right? It's a little bit more, you're getting more of that sort of sagebrush and herbal characteristic to it than you would in a warmer vintage, for example. Um, let's jump into Bon Premier Cru. And if memory serves, and I'm going to ask you to pronounce them, there's a couple of vineyards that we're using that go into this really special wine. If you could kind of remind me those vineyards, or rather pronounce those vineyards for me.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I find really fascinating, and I would say specifically with the Bon Premier Cru, the cooperage, the decisions that we make in the United States on how we use oak that's coming from Bon, right down the road. Francois Ferrer is a great cooper that we've worked with for many years. Matter of fact, we stayed at some of their properties, and the decisions that you make for cooperage in California versus the cooperage that you make in Bon. I think it's fascinating that you can make your decisions so much later in the journey in Burgundy, right? Because it's literally across the street. It doesn't have to cross the pond. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, what your decisions are, which barrels you like to use, from other coopers in general, and maybe use that as a fun touch point for the Bon Premier Cru.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Bon Premier Cru, this wine is really, I would say, the most fruit forward wine that is produced within this tier. Bon Premier Crus and Bon wines in general have always been, the reputation has always been fruit, which is not always the case in Burgundy Red. So that's the case here. But what I love about this wine is that we use a little bit more whole cluster with the Bon Premier Cru, and that couples really, really nicely with the fruit, and it gives it a little bit more structure. It gives it a little bit more strength, and it makes it a little bit more of a powerful wine. So I think that the Bon Premier Cru is always a fascinating wine. It's primarily sourced from two vineyards called Le Turon and Les Bressons. So those are two really excellent Premier Crus in Beaune. To get to the topic on the cooperages, yeah, it's a different ball game in Burgundy, because for one, all of our barrels do come from France for the most part. Most of them come from Burgundy, and we are, over time, we've learned the barrels that work really, really well in California wines. Our wines tend to be a little bit kind of softer and more supple, and they might need more tannin, and you can get tannin from oak. We have certain barrels that we figured out that work really, really well on our California wines, and it's not necessarily the same case on the Burgundy wines, right? As well as the Oregon wines. So it's definitely another puzzle piece to play around with. There's more tannin, like we've covered, in the Burgundy wines. So putting a barrel on it that provides a lot of tannin is maybe not the best choice, because now you're kind of doubling up on the texture of the wine. So finding something that's going to help soften that and make it a little bit more glossy and creamy is the goal there. And we've experimented with barrels that there's one cooper that I'm thinking particularly of that we put it on some California wines, and it was the same thing, but it was the opposite effect. Mm-hmm. It was a nice juicy wine. It was very soft. It was very supple, very approachable, and we gave it like a creamy barrel, like a barrel that kind of helps soften and just kind of fills in all the cracks. And it was like mousse, mm-hmm. like just chocolate mousse. It's like so
too much,
decadent and way too much. I mean, wonderful to taste and try, but not as a part of the blend, and not really. It does, we don't need to add that on top, right? So, mm-hmm. We tried those on the Burgundy wines, and boom, just beautiful,
just incredible.
So, we can order the barrels much later in the process. Sometimes even after they've been, fermented, you can kind of call them in, and then they show up, shortly thereafter, and mm-hmm. It's great. So, you can work really, really precisely with the quantity and the selections, because you have a chance to sometimes evaluate the wine before you make those purchases to kind of really dial that in a touch more.
Yeah, and in the States, right, we have to make those decisions months and months in advance to just get the barrels here, right? So it's so cool. I think the journey of winemaking, and this is all, by the way, still through the same grape. This is all through the lens of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which we'll talk a little bit about toward the end here. But it is pretty wild, you know. And as we kind of go into the last wine, the Nuit Saint Georges, first year making wine from Nuit Saint Georges, obviously, as Julian was mentioning, a cultural heritage directly to it. I mean, thinking about the region of Burgundy, the vineyards, the furthest vineyards apart from one another, basically Chablis, which is primarily Chardonnay, all the way to the southern part of Burgundy, right? That north to south is around 75 miles, 150-ish kilometers. And you think about how very different even just the glasses of wine that you're tasting at this moment are. And those vineyards and those sites are pretty darn close to one another, relatively speaking, right? Yeah. In California, our furthest vineyards apart from one another are 500 miles. I mean, it's just mind-boggling when you think about that. And then you take a grape like Pinot Noir that is so delicate and really does show its sense of place, so much more so than a lot of other grapes that live out in the world. It is really cool to kind of go on this exploration of, yeah, you can have Pinot Noirs from two vineyards that are right beside one another. Volnay and Pommard are pretty darn close to each other, and they taste wildly different. So it's a really, I think that's probably what keeps those of us who are total Pinot heads, that kind of keeps us engaged with the grape. It's pretty cool. We'll talk about Nuit Saint Georges.
Yeah, so Nuit Saint Georges, this is one of the, so like you mentioned, Volnay, Pommard, and Beaune, they're all really close to each other. I mean, it's in order from south to north, Volnay, Pommard, Beaune, and Pommard is not more than, I don't know, 2 or 3 miles from each Volnay and Beaune. Yep. So, and I think that's I'm probably exaggerating that because I don't want to, undercut it. But anyway, they're very close to one another. The wines are very different from one another. And Beaune is the northernmost part of the southern half of the Côte d'Or. Côte de Beaune is the southern part, and the northern part is Côte de Nuit. And the very first appellation in Côte de Nuit is Nuit Saint Georges. So we're on the southern part of the northern side of Burgundy, and the northern side of Burgundy is definitely much more, the production is much more focused on Pinot, whereas the southern part is, I don't know the breakdown exactly, but there's a lot more whites in the south of Burgundy compared to the north. So Nuit Saint Georges, about 96% of the grapes grown in that appellation are red, and the remainder are Chardonnay. And when I say red, of course, that's Pinot. That's all that there is grown there. So, but yeah, so these wines now are getting definitely a little bit more, a little bit more fruit, a little bit more powerful, a little bit more, structure. It's kind of like, I would say, if I had to compare this wine to one of the wines we've already produced, I would say it's more along the lines of Pommard. A little bit stronger structure, a little bit more, powerful wine, more fruit. But instead of it, there's not really a lot of earthy notes in Pommard. The Nuit Saint Georges is definitely a little bit more. There's like a little bit more of like a savory note. Like you can get some of those. Like cured meats and like I don't know, some of those types of characters that you have these dark fruits along with these other savory notes, and you get a really, really complex wine. And this wine is no exception. Nuit Saint Georges, excellent appellation for Pinot, and we are so thrilled that we had an opportunity to source some grapes and wine from Nuit Saint Georges, and we're thrilled. And we're expanding the Nuit Saint Georges. We liked this wine so much that we decided that we really wanted to kind of expand the Nuit Saint Georges program. So in 2022, we made it one of the a much larger production. So
and speaking of, because I think I've seen a few friends that are in the industry on the trade side of things, or might be wine buyers out there. As we all know, 2021 vintage in particular was a very small vintage for all Burgundy producers. There are a very, very small amount of these wines that we were able to make. Sarah Bachelek, a lot of our restaurant friends. There's a teeny tiny amount of a couple of these wines that we're going to be making available to some great restaurant partners out there. But for the most part, the really only way to get these wines is to purchase them through the allocation that's live right now. So if you are a customer and you love these wines and you would like to, enjoy some of these wines, log into your account. And if you have an allocation, do pick them up, wish for some. There's a teeny tiny amount of that 2020 vintage of the Givre Chambertin. That is teeny tiny amount of that available to some if you'd like to wish for some of that, because perhaps you want to put it back in your cellar or get more for your cellar. And I think as we, sort of close out here, I'd love to talk a little bit more about Chardonnay. We started out our journey making 2020 vintage Marceau, which is a beautiful wine. And frankly, I think in general, white Burgundy wines or Chardonnay wines from Burgundy are phenomenal and are definitely built to age. Some of my favorite old wines I've ever had have been Chardonnay from Burgundy that have been 20 years old. Just phenomenal. Definitely breaking the myth that white wine doesn't age, because it ages quite well. And my favorite region in the entire world, and as Julian knows this, and one of my favorite vineyards in the entire world is from Chablis. And pretty exciting that in vintage 22 we actually started making wine from Chablis. I have to wait a little bit longer before that'll be coming out next year. But maybe Julian, just talk a little bit about kind of our journey of Chardonnay in Burgundy, because that's also near and dear to both you and me.
Yeah, well, so originally, the concept started with just Pinot, and we were, the fun thing about working for Casa Brown and just, having such an incredible, following and fans and people who, generally trust us to just do the right thing is, we kind of have, we can have this adventurous spirit. And basically it was like, at one point it was like, why didn't we even think about a white wine? It's like, well, yeah, let's think. Okay, and sure enough, we kind of thought about, which region, and we thought that Merceau, aside from being an excellent appellation, we thought it was, I don't know, maybe the closest thing that we could identify in terms of what a California Chardonnay might taste like. So we went for Merceau. We produced a beautiful, beautiful Merceau that I think really was the sleeper of the release in 2020. A lot of people who bought only a couple bottles, they were calling, 6 months later, be like, "Oh my God, that turned out to be my favorite wine. Do you have any more?" And I'm like, "Well, oh yeah, okay. Like we might be able to help you out." So there is still an opportunity to potentially to capture the last little bit of the 2020s. Because we always, hold back a little bit of wine just for events and future things. So that wine turned out to be stunning. But after the 2021 frost, like I mentioned earlier, it really, really knocked the Chardonnays back. And so there was like virtually no Merceau available in 2021. And just whites in general, Chablis got hit really hard as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 2022, while keeping, our wishes of continuing to make a Merceau alive, it really, the 21 vintage really shook up the supply side of all of the whites in Burgundy. So Chablis is a much bigger region. I love Chablis. Chablis from Davosat is one of my aha wines,
Totally.
Back in like 2013. Former winemaker Nico Cueva put a Davosat Chablis in front of me, and at first I didn't quite get it, and then after like 15 or 20 minutes I was like, this is insane. So Chablis Premier Cru in 2022, and that is, I think, what we're going to be kind of focusing on in the future in terms of continuing to make our core white
Totally.
white Burgundy from Chablis and Premier Cru. So it's fantastic. We're looking forward to that going into bottle next year and having a chance to offer that to everybody. But yeah, I mean, to hold you over, maybe a little bit more Merceau. And in the meantime, next year, look out for that Chablis.
I'm
Really,
beyond
really
excited
cool.
for that Chablis. I also have had some incredible aha, like Le Clos Vineyard 03, William Fev, like mind exploding. So good. I'm so excited to see our journey with Chablis and our take on this iconic terroir.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody who's joined. I saw some very friendly faces on the chat today. Thank you so much for your questions. Please reach out. Please pick up your allocations. Reach out. Wish for some wine. Don't sleep on these because it's a little teeny tiny amount. Really, like I said, Mother Nature didn't give us a lot in 2021, but we did get us really darn delicious. So you should grab them. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. For those of you in the industry, happy harvest, and we'll see you all again next time.
All right. Cheers. Thanks, everybody.